Hey everyone, and welcome back to Practical CSS Grid. This is exercise number 2, where we will be creating a fluid promo card grid, much like the one we had before, but with no breakpoints this time. I hope you took a few minutes after exercise 1 and played around with grid template columns, because we're going to be utilizing that more and more as we go through these examples. In this example, we're going to be using two new functions in CSS. The first of which is the repeat function, and the second of which is the min-max function. We're going to pair these together to create this excellent fluid promo card grid that has no breakpoints to adjust the number of columns on each row. Let's go ahead and dive in. As you can see, exercise number 2 starting point, start.html, has no CSS. Our grid is not saved from exercise 1. I think it's always a good chance to practice the skills that we've used in the previous exercises. So we're going to go ahead and redefine our grid as we had it in exercise 1. So I'm going to use the display grid property. I'm going to use grid template columns for our column definitions, and we're going to do 1FR 3 times again for our grid columns. And then we're going to define our grid gap as well, just to make everything look a little nicer. We're going to do 1.5 rem this time around. And now when we go back and refresh the page, you can see we have a lovely 3-column grid. And again, just like in exercise number 1, this does not account for our various screen sizes and various resolutions. This is going to be what we're working through in this exercise. So first and foremost, I want to show you a very handy function in CSS. It's specifically used in these grid column definitions and grid row definitions. Instead of actually having 1FR, 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 which is definitely repetitive and not very dry, we can use the repeat function, and that's going to take a value, an integer between 1 and, I don't even know, probably 255, something along those lines, and a unit value. And this is going to repeat that unit value however many times in the first argument. So in this case, it will render out to 3 1FR columns. And we should refresh the page and see absolutely no change, which is what we see. I'll open up Inspector just to prove that our code is live. We look at article grid and we come down here. You can see it is now repeat 3, 1FR, 3 columns of 1FR each. So this is handy. If you had a 5-column grid or a 12-column grid or even a 24-column grid, you could specify those same numbers in that first property and you would get a grid of that size. Obviously not what we're going for in this one. So we're going to use 2 new keywords. The first is going to be the min-max function. What this does, relatively self-descriptively, is specify a minimum value and a maximum value that our grid columns will take up. So in this case, we're going to have this be between 360 pixels and 1FR. So every time as we size the screen down, we have a box that reaches the 360 pixel minimum. It's going to automatically start breaking onto the next line because we're also going to specify a keyword for our counter here. Instead of 3 having a firm 3 columns, I'm going to specify auto fill. There's also an auto fit, and the differences are mainly just how they deal with white space. So I'm going to switch back over. As you can see, we still have a 3-column grid here, but as we size up, we go to 4-column, and as we size down, every time these boxes reach 360 pixels wide, they break and they take up the full remaining width of that column. So in this case, we went from 2 columns of between 360 pixels and around like 500 pixels. And then as soon as we hit a point where the second column no longer fits at 360 pixels wide, it breaks on to the next line, and all of the columns then become that 1FR value. And this works all the way down to mobile sizes. So this is a very, very handy way of utilizing grid to replace all sorts of amounts of code. Now, one thing that you may have noticed, and you may have noticed it in the first exercise, is we still have some awkward white space inside of each of our cards. And this is kind of the curse of web development in general, or at least of web design in general, in that we have to deal with awkward white space at various sizes. And we can do that in the same way we would in Flexbox, and we can use what's called the box alignment module in CSS, and that is going to work roughly the same as it does in Flexbox. We're going to come in here to our parent div, and we're going to have a align items property, and we're going to tell it to align items start. And you're not going to see a huge difference here other than the actual area itself has shrunk. This is one way of utilizing awkward white space. If you want your awkward white space to be outside of your card and in the grid in general, you can actually do that. And now, as you can see when I show you the grid in Firefox DevTools, that each of the cards takes up only the height that it has inherently with its content. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this, so we're going to actually define a new grid inside of each of these cards. So I'm going to go ahead and remove align items from this, and you're going to see it's going to go back, and we're going to have that awkward white space in the bottom of each card. And then inside of the children elements, I'm going to define a new grid, display grid. And as you can see, we lose that white space, but now our button sizes are stretched. So that extra white space actually gets added to the last row of this new grid, which is fine, except for each of these slightly shorter cards that we've got now has slightly awkwardly tall buttons. Now it's kind of hard to see here. Let's see if I can get a better resolution here. You can't quite see it, but you can see here we've got a little bit of differences, and I like my buttons to align at the bottom of each card. So what we can do is we can come in here into our code and define that align items here. So the default to align items is going to be, it's an auto, but it actually basically boils down to stretch. So I say that in nothing should change in our example, except for you can kind of see a slight white space change, but that button down at the bottom is still stretched. So I'm going to go back into code, and I'm going to define, instead of stretch, I want them to align to the start. And what this does is it aligns them to the topmost portion of their own row. So we'll go back into the example, refresh, and you can see that awkward white space is now added back to the bottom. Not necessarily what we were going for, but now that we have a line item set on the parent and the parent is a grid, I can actually come up into my HTML, and we're going to grab the class name from our buttons, which is article__button. We're going to put it into our CSS, and I can now use the align self property and specify end. And what this is going to do is inside of the grid row itself that the button is in, it's going to align the button to the end. So now there can be as much copy and content up above as you want, and those buttons are always going to be anchored to the very bottom of each card. So I hope you can see there's a lot of power to utilizing grid in a lot of different ways. Normally, I would say you don't need grid for a one-column layout because display block works just fine. But if you want to allocate white space differently, you can very easily define a grid inside of a grid item and allocate that white space with the box alignment module with that align items, align self methodology. I want you to take a little bit of time after this one, play around with that min-max function, see if you can find a sweet spot for your own designs, and then also play around with how the box alignment module plays with grid, because it is slightly different than it is with Flexbox, but it's going to function very, very similarly. So go ahead and do that, and I will see you in exercise 3.